when I was asked to speak on Fromm, I was both excited about it, but also knew the challenges involved. And we're going to be speaking about those challenges when it comes to Fromm and psychoanalysis. As I'm sure all of you know, Fromm is a very well-known figure as a result of his work as a public intellectual in the United States and in English-speaking countries. He reached his height in the 1950s and early 1960s. His books, virtually every one of them, sold in the millions of copies. And he lived in different countries. His life was shaped by the traumas and tragedies of the 20th century. But one of the things that so many people overlook, perhaps even those at the institute he helped to found, was that he was first and foremost, throughout all of the decades of his work and all of the writings of his books, a practicing psychoanalyst. Indeed, psychoanalysis was the one constant in his life. And the irony here is that we can access enormous amounts of writings, both primary and secondary, about Erich Fromm, about his achievements, about debates regarding what he said or didn't say or how he said it. But when it comes to his work as a psychoanalyst, there is very little information. And the first and foremost reason for that is that Erich Fromm did not write about clinical matters. There are only very few pieces, all of which I will draw on today, in which he speaks directly about his work with patients. And that's always left people curious. In fact, it's left the psychoanalysts perhaps more curious than anyone else. It's often the case that the sociologists or academics or historians who write about Erich Fromm don't even know that he was a practicing psychoanalyst as a result of this. He stated multiple times towards the end of his life that he did not want a Frommian school of psychotherapy. And he felt about that very strongly, which is interesting to note. We can make of that what we will. But in any case, that attitude meant that there were no significant writings on clinical work. I'm today going to focus on his clinical writings, and I'm going to give you a lot of different quotes that we can read together and think about together. And my primary focus here will be on understanding Erich Fromm as a key linkage in the emergence of contemporary relational psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. And I think one of the challenges we're up against there as well is that his ideas have, in a way, become commonplace. And we do not necessarily associate certain ways of thinking, certain ways of practicing with Erich Fromm. And yet it is through Erich Fromm that those ways of thinking and ways of practicing emerged, right? So there's some detective work involved here, which, given how well he's known, seems a little bit curious, right? But this is what we're up against. So let's dive right in. I have about 50 minutes or so, and we'll see how far we get. I thought I would begin just by giving you a few brief biographical details, and then we'll go to his work more directly. So let me ask first, can everyone hear me all right? Does anyone have any initial questions or concerns?
You're heard very well.
Okay, good. So a few biographical facts. He was born in Frankfurt in 1900 into an Orthodox Jewish German family, and he died in 1980 in Locarno, Switzerland. Over the course of his lifetime, he lived his first 32 years in Germany. In 1932, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis, and he essentially lived the next 2 years in Davos, Switzerland, at a sanatorium. And he witnessed the election of the Nazi Party in Germany from Switzerland, and then went directly from Switzerland to the United States in 1934. He lived in New York from 1934 to 1950. In 1950, he moved from New York to Mexico City because of the health concerns of his second wife, Henny Gerland. She died in 1952. He remained in Mexico City from 1950 until 1973, whereupon he retired and moved to Locarno, Switzerland, dying in 1980. So you can see just how many different segments there were of his life, and it's important to understand that these weren't just geographical segments. In each case, he was in different cultures and languages, right? And he flourished, and by all accounts, he was very linguistically skilled. And in contrast to many other German Jewish emigres and refugees of the 1930s, he very quickly became fluent in English and soon began to write in English. And that's quite significant. He grew up in a family with famous rabbinic ancestors, and early in life was quite influenced by their work, and saw himself and identified himself as religious, and was very involved in Jewish learning and thinking. For example, in Frankfurt, he became a member of the so-called Frie Jewish Learning Circle, in which was also involved the philosopher Franz Rosenzweig, Martin Buber, and Gershom Scholem, and he got to know all of them personally. And I think we can see the influences of some of their ideas in his work. And in 1918, he came out very much against the war and against nationalism. That idea, that kernel, would stay with him throughout his life. He was at first supposed to study law, but he changed track and studied sociology, receiving his doctorate at the University of Heidelberg in 1922. There he also studied with Karl Jaspers and Heinz Rickard, again, greats of the era. And his dissertation advisor was the brother of Max Weber, Alfred Weber, a famous sociologist in his own right. In the following years, he got to know Frie from Reichmann through friends and colleagues. She was working in Dresden at the time, and he would often travel to Dresden to meet with her and spend time with her. The two of them then hatched an idea to found a sanatorium, or I should say really a clinic, called Terra Clinic, it was called, and it was in the city of Heidelberg. And it was created specifically for a Jewish clientele. And everyone went to live and work there. And Frie from Reichmann was the only trained analyst. And everyone who lived and worked there needed to enter into analysis with her, including the cook and the cleaning staff and Erich Fromm. And so Erich Fromm went into analysis with Frie from Reichmann, Frieda Reichmann, I should say, who was some 11 years older than him. And they soon fell in love during this period, and the analysis was stopped. And Karl Landauer, another famous German psychoanalyst of the period, who was a mentor to both of them, gave their marriage his blessing. And so they proceeded to get married. Of course, any marriage that begins on that basis likely isn't going to last too long. And after a few years, they indeed separated, though they remained lifelong close friends and colleagues. So they separated on very good terms. Another significant point, in 1926, both Frieda and Erich essentially gave up their religiosity and became secular and developed a humanistic outlook on life. Both had been from an Orthodox background. And so what we find is up until that point, Fromm was immersed in the academic sociological world, but he was also began to be immersed in the psychoanalytic world. And with the support of Frie, he went on to have an analysis in Munich with Wittenberg, and then he went from there to Berlin and became an analyst at the Berlin Psychoanalytic Institute. So much for biographical details. I want to now sort of jump into some of his key ideas as they developed. So let me open up the PowerPoint here. And whoops, that probably doesn't work yet. So
share screen, green.
Yep. Okay. So can you see that?
Yeah.
Excellent. Can you see the full screen or my view? There.
Oh, no. Now it's better.
Okay, excellent. So here again is a very important list. Back to the point I made very early on, we oftentimes fail to recognize Fromm's significance as a psychoanalyst. I think these facts stand out and speak for themselves very quickly. We can go through them. 1929, he graduated from the Berlin Institute. He worked at the Frie Clinic in Berlin and also helped set up a Frie Clinic. If you remember Elizabeth Danto's book on the Frie Clinics in Frankfurt. In 1929, with Karl Landauer and Frie, they set up the Southwest German Institute for Psychoanalysis, which became the Frankfurt Institute that we know today. In 1930, he became director of social psychology at the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt, where he applied psychoanalysis to the study of society. In 1943, he co-founded the William Alanson White Institute. In 1951, he founded the psychoanalytic section of the medical school of the National Autonomous University in Mexico City. In 1956, he founded the Mexican Institute of Psychoanalysis. And in 1962, he founded the International Federation of Psychoanalytic Societies. All of these institutes exist today. And so it begs the question, perhaps one we can discuss together, of why is it we know so little about Fromm as a psychoanalyst? Does that say something about Fromm, or does that say something about our reception of his ideas as psychoanalysts? So maybe we can just keep that question in mind. A few more facts that are important. I went through some of these already. Fromm arrived in New York in 1934. He then arranged for a visa for Frie, who had already fled to Palestine, and she came in 1935. Clara Thompson, who you've already heard about, also arrived back in New York in 1934, having had a 3-year analysis with Forense in Budapest. And she joined with Sullivan for a short time, becoming his analyst. In 1936, Sullivan asked Fromm to teach at the newly founded Washington School of Psychiatry. In the years after Fromm arrived, he became very closely involved with Sullivan and affiliated psychoanalysts, and with sociologists and anthropologists, all of whom were connected with the Yale Seminar on Culture and Personality. Over the coming years, Sullivan, Thompson, Fromm, Reichman, and Horney, who Fromm knew from Berlin and got to know much better in New York. In fact, we know now had a relationship with her in New York, worked closely on the primacy of social and cultural factors in human development. So they didn't trace neurosis to biological factors. On the contrary, they said that we must look at the role of society and culture. The Institute was founded in 1943. Sullivan died in 1949. Fromm moved to Mexico in 1950, though he spent many months of each year continuing to teach and supervise at the Institute. After Sullivan's death and Fromm's moving to Mexico, Thompson plays a key role in developing the interpersonal point of view, weaving together Sullivan with Ferenczi and Fromm. Another oft overlooked fact, but I think a very significant one, was that Fromm was actually Thompson's third analyst, thus completing what we could call a circle of influence amongst the founders of the interpersonal school. So my talk will consist of two parts. The first part is going to be on his psychoanalytic approach, on his, if we will, work with the patient. And here it's important to note straight away, in the 1920s and early 30s, Fromm and Erich and Frida would often travel to Baden-Baden, a spa city in southwest Germany, to visit with Grodek. And there they met Ferenczi, who was a frequent visitor. And that gave Fromm the opportunity to get to know Ferenczi and his work. Late in life, Fromm was interviewed and said that his psychoanalytic approach was most closely influenced or resembled Grodek and Ferenczi, above all Ferenczi's attitude of relatedness with his patients. And I will speak about that in just a moment. In the second part of my talk, we'll think about the idea of the social character and the social unconscious. So briefly, as an introduction, Fromm seeks to understand and relate to his patients in the here and now, both in terms of engaging in their concrete details of living and in terms of engaging the social and cultural values that shape their experience. He says that our social character as individuals is shaped by the way we consciously and unconsciously adapt to the economic, cultural, and historical contexts of our society. This process, however, often has a negative impact. Modern culture provides false solutions to human living and thus inscribes what he calls pathology into human relationships. As a result, society becomes a means to escape from freedom, the name of one of his famous books. Character types can be either productive or unproductive. Being productive is generative, involves finding meaning in life, and relates to freedom. So, before we begin speaking about those two parts, the sense of relatedness, his psychoanalytic approach, and social character, I think it's absolutely essential that we come to know a key article that he wrote in 1935. So he had already arrived in New York. This article was written in the Journal of the Institute for Social Research, which he had helped move to New York and secured a position at Columbia for. And this was one of the last pieces he wrote in German. It wasn't translated into English until the early 2000s, which in itself is a very interesting point, because it is absolutely essential to understanding Fromm's entire work. In this article, he presents both his technical ideas, his psychoanalytic work with patients, and his critical social theory. And both are essential to understanding Fromm as a clinician. So first off, Fromm makes clear his opposition to Freud's recommendations on psychoanalytic technique from 1912 and 1915, and he allies himself explicitly with Ferenczi. Interpersonalists often trace back Ferenczi's influence through Thompson and Thompson's analysis with Ferenczi, and that is indeed correct. What tends to be entirely overlooked, however, is Fromm's relationship with Ferenczi and Fromm's early work on Ferenczi. Secondly, Fromm demonstrates how Freud and psychoanalysis have been shaped by bourgeois society And he argues that without a critical social awareness, the analyst simply ends up reinforcing the values of the status quo. The article creates an unbridgeable gap between Fromm and Horkheimer and the Institute for Social Research, who are unable to accept his cutting critique of Freud. And finally, this article awakens the lively interest of the circle of psychoanalysts connected with Sullivan and affiliated anthropologists and sociologists. So it really is a watershed, as it were, in Fromm's work and life. What does he actually say? Let's just take a moment and think about this together. Fromm points out that psychoanalysts at the time are almost exclusively members of the metropolitan liberal bourgeoisie. Indeed, if we look around today, it probably is quite similar. Quote, bourgeois society is characterized by its patriarchal or patricentric character. And quote, Freud is a classical representative of the patricentric character type. According to this point of view, Fromm says, the meaning of life lies not in the person's happiness or well-being, but in the fulfillment of duty and subordination to authority. There is no unconditional right to love and happiness, end quote. He aligns this point closely with Freud's cultural theory, which is based almost exclusively at the time on the conflict between father and son. It's likewise revealed in Freud's hidden animosity, as he says, towards happiness and enjoyment, and in the fact that love and tenderness in Freud's work seem to appear only as feelings accompanying sexual enjoyment. Fromm reads Freud's technical prescriptions along the same lines. He quotes from Fromm's emphasis on indifference, emotional coldness, or on being opaque to their patients. And the parallel Freud makes to the surgeon who, quote, should put aside all his feelings, even his sympathy. They're seen by Fromm as reflections of the patriarchal bourgeois values of the time. Even Freud's discussion of the analyst's quote unquote tolerance, and Freud actually talks about the fact that the analyst should be tolerant of the patient's weaknesses, is seen by Fromm as a reflection of the liberal bourgeois notion of tolerance that exists only with certain limits, and so long as the system itself is not threatened. Fromm says this is exemplified by Freud's dismissal of Frense and his patient-centered and caring relational approach. Fromm does not mince words. In fact, the article, if you're interested, it's available, is really very, very cutting. And it helps us to understand why the Freudians weren't at all pleased with him. He refers to, quote, Freud's patricentric, authoritarian, deep down misanthropic tolerance, end quote, and contrasts it to Ferencze's, quote, philanthropic, meaning giving an affirmative attitude towards the patient, end quote. Fromm thus argues that, one, we're fundamentally shaped by society. We're social beings. Two, that the family plays a key role in this process. And three, that the analyst herself is always embedded in society and its values. The analyst does not stand apart. And that is an absolutely key point that we'll think some more about. I've included lots of quotes to look at, but in the interest of time, I should probably move on. You can read that yourself. My voice is already disappearing. So I hope everyone is still with me.
We are with you.
Okay, good. I can't see you, so I'm just assuming you're all still there. So, first part of my talk, really an extension: psychoanalysis and human relatedness, or the attitude we bring to our work with patients. The fundamental point, and really fundamental, of Fromm's approach to work with patients is being centrally related. For Fromm, how we relate to others how we relate to others and to our patients is of primary concern. He sees learning to love as an overarching goal in life and vital to our well-being. So if anyone would ask Fromm, how do we define well-being? How do we think about health? He would talk about the ability to love. Here's a quote: "Love is the active concern for the life and the growth of being." Whoops, that should be included there. And these are quotes from Fromm's clinical lectures from 1959 that he gave at the William Allenton White Institute, but again, that were not published until much, much later. In fact, after he passed away, which is curious, right? We can talk about that. I can explain the other person. Oh, I'm sorry. When I use the concept central relatedness, I mean the relatedness from center to center, instead of the relatedness from periphery to periphery. Now you have to put yourself back in the 1940s and 50s. You have to think of the interpersonal school of psychoanalysis as being, as it were, the loyal, but the opposition to the dominant school of ego psychology. And you need to understand, I think, some of these points he is making in contrast to ego psychology. Another quote: "I can explain the other person as another ego, or I can relate to this other person in the sense of being him, in the sense of experiencing, feeling this other person. Then I do not think about myself. Then my ego does not stand in my way. But something entirely different happens. There is what I call a central relatedness between me and him." This is what I would call his therapeutic attitude. Just read with me and let's get a feel for what Fromm says. "An essential factor is that I'm completely open to the patient. At this moment, when I speak with a patient or the patient speaks with me, there is no more important event in the world for me or for her. I'm completely open to her, and all I promise her is just that. When you come to me, I will be completely open to you, and I shall respond with all the chords in myself which are touched by the chords in yourself. That is all we can promise, and that is a promise we can keep. We cannot keep the promise that we'll cure her. We cannot keep the promise even that we will understand everything, but we can keep the promise of being completely open and to respond. A sense of union, of sharing, of oneness, which is something much stronger than being kind or being nice. There's a feeling of human solidarity when two people, or even one person, can say to the other, so that is you, and I share this with you. This is a tremendously important experience. I would say, short of complete love, it is the most gratifying, the most wonderful, the most exhilarating experience which occurs between two people. And this is also one of the most important therapeutic experiences which we can give to the patient, because at that moment, the patient does not feel isolated anymore. In all his neuroses or whatever his troubles are, the feelings of isolation, whether he is aware of it or not, is the very crux of his suffering. There are many other cruxes, but this is the main one. At the moment when he senses that I share this with him, so that I can say, this is you, and I can say it not kindly and not unkindly, this is a tremendous relief from isolation. This, what he just said, became known later in Fromm's life as direct encounter. So what does that mean in practice? Well, let's listen to what Ruth Lesser, a well-known psychoanalyst at NYU postdoc and head of the interpersonal track there, who died, I believe, in 2004, has relayed about her work with Fromm. She says, "As I sat with Fromm, I heard a sense of urgency. Time was precious. His directness then was not condemnation, but an expression of hope and faith, yet speaking honestly and clearly to the healthy, striving adult in the patient would foster awareness and ultimately the freedom to fulfill unexplored potentialities. And very importantly, People have sometimes characterized Fromm as confrontational and judgmental in both his supervisory and analytic stance. This is perhaps understandable because, unlike more cautious traditional analysts, he was always focused directly on what he saw as a patient's core orientation. There is no waiting for just the right moment, no hesitation about articulating his judgments, and no equivocation about just the right dosage of truth. Which good-humored irony, he noted, quote, "There's nothing polite in anybody's unconscious, including the analysts." But I think the key point, and this is the reason I show you this quote, is that Fromm's directness was something he engaged in only when he felt the two of them, he and the patient, had a moment of real meeting. Did he misjudge those moments? I'm sure he did. Let's learn more about it. This is what I call thoughts of mutuality. We understand a person fully only in as much as we are centrally related to him. If we understand the patient, then we understand ourselves, everything the patient tells us. If we understand only if they strike that chord within ourselves. That is why we can talk with authority to the patient, because we're not talking about him anymore. We're not talking about our own experience, which has been made manifest through his telling us what he experiences. This is indeed where the patient analyzes us. I do not mean that he analyzes us by saying anything, although that sometimes happens too. And I must say that I've learned some of the most important things from what some patients have said about me in analysis. And that goes to answer the question whether Fromm ever worked with his patients using the relationship. He didn't generally, but I think we could argue that he helped form the basis for doing so. If you relate to the patient, not as a thing over there whom you study, but if you try to experience in yourself what the patient feels, then indeed you will experience the whole realm, the whole world, which is not in the conscious mind. And by being in touch with it, you analyze yourself because you become more and more aware. I would say this is the unique thing about the psychoanalytic profession. So one of the things I thought about after you asked me to speak is, how does this relate to more contemporary or even more familiar approaches? And these are two examples that came up. The first was the British object relationist Harry Guntrip, when it comes to the application of Fromm's idea, that was a slip, of central relatedness. Guntrip says in 1969, psychotherapy can only be carried on by those who are prepared to be exposed to all the subtle reactions that go on between two human beings who meet on an emotional rather than on an intellectual plane, and who are prepared to accept awareness of these reactions as essential to treatment. What is therapeutic when it is achieved is the moment of real meeting of two persons as a new transforming experience for one of them, which is, as Ronald Lang said, not what happened before, but what has never happened before. Darlene Ehrenberg, in her work on the intimate edge, makes a similar point. She says, therapeutic work does not stop when contact is made, or when each is truly touched in some profound way by the other and by their interaction. Rather, it takes on new dimensions as the effective complexity of what gets activated in the moments of meeting can be clarified and explored in an endless progression, end quote. I include both of those quotes just so you can see, I would suggest, how prevalent Fromm's ideas actually are. Whilst he may not have written a great deal, he did have, over decades, a great many students and analysans. And I would suggest to you that his ideas spread that way, rather than through his writings. Here's another point. And I'm looking at the time and realizing I'm probably not going to be able to read all of this. But let me read the second one at least. He made a key point about the necessity of aliveness in our work with patients. And in the second quote, he says, there is only one criterion for whether a session is satisfactory or not, one minimum criterion, that the session is interesting. If a session is boring, either for the patient or for myself, something is certainly wrong. I remember very well the sessions during my transition from Freudian methods to other methods, when I was so bored that I could hardly wait till the end of the session. I listened dutifully, I made every effort, and yet I was just waiting for the session to end. This was actually the reason why I felt there was something fundamentally wrong in my way of going about it. I know my teachers were awfully bored too, because many of them fell asleep during the analysis. And I remember how shocked I was when I heard one of my teachers say at a party that he had found a new tobacco, which helped him to keep from falling asleep. By all accounts, Fromm found his work, his training analysis with Hans Sachs absolutely deadening. So I think we can read some of this emerging out of that experience, but it's also a reflection of Fromm's own character as a person, his personality. And here are two quotes from one, an analysand, another, a supervisee. Jorge Silva Garcia relayed, an analysand, after a year and a half of Freudian psychoanalysis on the couch in Chicago in 47 and 48, my psychoanalysis, which took place in Mexico, with Dr. Fromm from 1950 on, was a very intense experience. His use of face-to-face dialogue was a totally different experience from previous analyses, meaningful, intense, direct. The dialogue happened in the here and now. David Schechter, a well-known interpersonal analyst and supervisee of Fromm, adds, Erich Fromm was the most fully alive and awake man I have ever met or can imagine. These qualities were contagious. To be truly with him, one felt fully alike and awake. I helped to produce a book back in 2009 called The Clinical Erich Fromm, which is published by Brill. And in that book, Rainer Funk collected together the reports of many of Fromm's analysands and supervisees, and that's where each of these three illustrations are from, for those of you who are interested. Again, there's so much more information. We can't go through it all in the interest of time, but one of the key points was the necessity, absolute necessity, to avoid intellectualization and to stay with experience. And staying with experience also meant a recognition and acknowledgement of embodiment for Fromm. And I think that too is a key point. Let's continue. I'll just give you a moment, give my voice a break. One of the things that's often forgotten is that in 1951, I'm not sure why I always do that, Fromm wrote a well-known book. For many decades, there was sort of talk of the fact that the interpersonalists, because they were interested in the relationship, were less interested in dreams. Well, I think the fact that in 1951, Fromm wrote a well-known book, though largely forgotten, on dreams, counters that. Fromm's interest here in dreams is really quite significant. Let's go through it. Fromm was especially interested in the manifest, not the latent content of dreams. So, of course, he also acknowledged that. The manifest content being their so-called day residue. He felt that dreams could disclose something about the dreamer's daily experience that they were not aware of, if the dreamer's associations were sufficiently explored. Fromm believed that dreams should be understood in terms of their relevance to the here and now, rather than referring back to infantile memories. Of course, he's talking directly about Freud, and similarly, that their symbols should not be interpreted mainly in terms of their sexual meaning, but in terms of their broader applications to the patient's life in the here and now. Finally, for Fromm, the dreamer needs to be the active participant in understanding their dreams. Carola Mann has relayed to me, or did relay to me, she passed away some years ago, that Fromm would often ask what might have prompted the dreamer to dream as they did. If you look at this book, the book is really an exploration and rebuttal of the dream theories of Freud and Jung, and then sort of reading onto them and developing Freud's, Fromm's own approach, not only to dreams, but also, of course, to fairy tales, which were of interest to Freud and Jung. So, Part 2, we haven't the time to go through all of this, so I'm going to skip some slides, but if we're going to understand Fromm as a psychoanalyst, we absolutely have to have a grasp of what he means by social character. So let's go through that. And this is, again, both, I think, what makes Fromm stand apart, also within the interpersonal school, but also what may have led him to be seen to be on the periphery of psychoanalysis as it was practiced in the mid-century decades. Fear of Freedom, published in 1941, just at this point at which the United States entered the war, was an attempt to explain and make sense of how it was that Germans enthusiastically supported Hitler. It really encapsulated Fromm's developing theory of social character. And in that book, Fromm talks about the authoritarian character which exists in German society at the time and shapes the way that Germans think. It had, of course, a much broader relevance. In the appendix to that book, Fromm makes probably the most clear and explicit statement about the new interpersonal approach. I'll read it. The fundamental approach to human personality is the understanding of the human being's relationship to the world, to others, to nature, and to him or herself. That sentence is significant. The relationship to the world comes first. What does Fromm mean by that? He means that we need to understand the way we exist in society. And if we can understand that, we can understand how we relate to ourselves. That's the inverse of the way psychology and the psychological professions have traditionally thought, that tend to focus on the individual mind first and only secondarily try to understand our connection to society and culture and to our environment. Fromm quite literally puts that on its head. He says we need to understand the way that society shapes us. Then we can understand who we are as individuals. Finally, he says, we believe that the individual psychology is fundamentally social psychology, or in Sullivan's term, the psychology of interpersonal relationships. He makes a similar point in Sane Society, which was published in 1946, just after World War II. Those are some of the clearest early statements of the interpersonal tradition, though, as we know, the term interpersonal psychoanalysis didn't come about until 1964. And up until that time, a term that was often applied to the work of the interpersonalists was cultural psychoanalysis, which had to do with their early affiliation with the anthropologists and sociologists. So, another quote, Fromm's express aim is to show how the social character of a group determines the thinking, feeling, and acting of individuals who belong to that group. Okay, so he's, in a way, he's thinking like a sociologist, which he was. And I would suggest it is precisely that kind of thinking that it's again becoming popularized in the last, especially in the last decade, in relational work. And we can make a direct connection back to Fromm's ideas. In fact, I'll show some examples of that. Unconscious social patterns. This is an extremely important point. I mentioned it already briefly, the idea that we develop in society unconsciously adapting to meet the needs of our society, even though they may conflict with our own well-being. This gives rise to Fromm's very famous statement that it is the function of social character to shape the energies of the members of society in such a way that their behavior is not left to conscious decisions whether or not to follow the social pattern, but that people want to act as they have to act. People want to act as they have to act. That suggests the existence of a social unconscious, and that is indeed what Fromm is referring to. The pathology of normalcy, that has become a term that is generally used and people are aware of. It stems from he coined it. We don't really have time to go into it a great deal, but he really applied it to consumerist capitalist society and the idea that we are inevitably embedded in the norms of our consumerist capitalist societies and live out these norms, again, even though they are not in our best interest. Now, Fromm's writings on these issues do have limitations, not least of which is Fromm is not afraid to stake out a position on what constitutes a good and moral life. Something perhaps we are more careful to do today because we recognize that there are multiple ways of living, right? Indeed, Fromm, in a sense, if he is able to say what a healthy and an unhealthy society is, also believes that there are an objective set of conditions that can explain that, right? And that, of course, runs up against the idea of universalizing. And the idea that not everyone's experiences are the same, and certainly not everyone's experiences are equal, and that there are differentials at work and society, particularly in relation to gender and race. Why is that important? Because I think this is one reason why a lot of people still draw on the Frankfurt School of Social Theory, but not necessarily so much on Fromm. But I think there's also a degree of misreading of Fromm's ideas here. Let me continue. Patriarchy and gender. Fromm's writings on patriarchy and gender were, in fact, very important. There's a 1934 article in which he not only questions, but explicitly criticizes the centrality of the Oedipus complex and the primacy of the patriarchal social structure in Freud's work. He essentially rejected the libidinal stages of development and conceived of human development in terms of imagined and actual relationships with other people. How is this relevant? He explicitly rejects Freud's psychology of women and argues that Freud is rationalizing patriarchy, that psychoanalysis is rationalizing patriarchy. He suggests that the patriarchal family is itself a product of its social constellation in society, right? And he argues that the family becomes the means by which the child is socialized into a world of gendered values. His ideas are informed by Karen Horney's writings on feminine psychology of the 1930s. And I think if we read Fromm, especially his works of the 1930s and 1940s, what really stands out for me are the parallels to the feminist mantra of the 1960s, and that is from the second wave, the personal is political. The idea that in order to understand our well-being, we have to understand and address social and political forces that shape us. And that analytic work can and should be paired with social and political activism. That's something Freud believed, Fromm believed.
Mhm.
And it is something we see again today. I would argue, especially within the relational school, right? The idea that those two can, and in fact, in many cases, need to be paired. And so Fromm is really someone who establishes a structure there. Time, I'm almost out, so I'm going to push forward a little bit. I'm almost through my slides in any case. There's a real emphasis on the social unconscious, right? The idea that we emerge in society without really realizing it. I tend, when I talk about and teach about culture and society, I tend to think about culture as being something like the air we breathe. We simply take it for granted. And it is not usually, unless something happens in life, that we become aware of and that we might be able to begin to reflect on the way that we have been formed in specific cultural sets of norms and values. And that's really what Fromm was trying to point out. And he was arguing and asking us as analysts to think about the way that the patient has been formed by cultural norms and values, and to inquire about their social and cultural worlds. And at the same time, and this is critical, to think about ourselves as analysts as also having been shaped by those norms and values, to really foster a critical awareness, a critical social awareness. We don't have time to read them, but if you want examples of Fromm's ideas when it comes to the social unconscious, I strongly encourage you to look at Phil Cushman's work. Those of you who read dialogues will be familiar with some of his articles. You may be familiar with his well-known book, Constructing the Self, Constructing America. He says that the unconscious is not an interior thing, but part of the patient's social landscape that contains potential feelings, thoughts, and experiences. Or Lynn Leighton's work. Here I quote from Lynn from 2014, but Lynn draws directly on Fromm's ideas of social character and social unconscious to develop her idea of normative unconscious processes, right? So we can see a direct trajectory, and yet we tend not to read Fromm, which is a really interesting point and makes me wonder why. I'm sure you too. Finally, we come back to what I think is really central to Fromm's work. There's so many ways we can talk about it, but it is the centrality of love to human well-being and to society. And I quote, "Love is possible only if two persons communicate with each other from the center of their existence. Hence, if each one of them experiences himself or herself from the center of their existence. Only in the central experience is human reality. Only here is aliveness. Only here is the basis for love. Love experienced thus is a constant challenge. It is not a resting place, but a moving, growing, and working together. And society must be organized in such a way that man's social, loving nature is not separated from his or her social existence, but becomes one with it. If it is true, as I've tried to show, that love is the only sane and satisfactory answer to the problem of human existence, then any society which excludes relatively the development of love must, in the long run, perish of its own contradiction with the basic necessities of human nature." And finally, but certainly not least, again, from the art of loving, I often give this to students to think about. These are some of Fromm's key ideas when it comes to the nature of love. I'll just go through it very briefly. Love has an active character, and Fromm reduces it to these four characteristics: care, responsibility, respect, and knowledge. And those of you who are familiar with Carol Gilligan's ethic of care, I think will certainly recognize some of these elements. Responsibility, in its true sense, is an entirely voluntary act. It is my response to the needs, expressed or unexpressed, of another human being. To be responsible means to be able and ready to respond. What a wonderful statement for the attitude and position of the analyst. Respect means the concern that the other person should grow and unfold as she is. Respect thus implies the absence of exploitation. I want the love person to grow and unfold for her own sake and in her own ways, and not for the purpose of serving me. If I love the other person, I feel one with her, but with her as she is, not as I need her to be as an object for my use. So this attitude is one of giving. Finally, to respect a person is not possible without knowing her. Care and responsibility would be blind if they were not guided by knowledge. Knowledge would be empty if it were not motivated by concern. There are many layers of knowledge. The knowledge which is an aspect of love, which is one which does not stay at the periphery, but penetrates the core. It is possible only when I can transcend the concern for myself and see the other person in her own terms. These ideas were really written up in the early 1950s, and I see them as really a crystallization of the central ideas of Fromm's analytic attitude, right? And so I think that's an example of how we can find Fromm's clinical ideas in works that are not directly clinical. With that, my talk comes to an end. Some of you may know that I've written and speak a good deal about Fromm's own family history, the traumas of the Holocaust in his family. And I think when I spoke earlier about the urgency that Fromm brings to his work, be it his work on social injustice or indeed with patients, I think it can be read back to some of the experiences he had in life. For those of you who are interested, here there are two recent YouTube lectures I've given directly on my translation into English of the Holocaust letters and Fromm's family. And perhaps I can share those for those of you who might, but if you look into YouTube and just put my name, they'll come up. And finally, this is the book that was mentioned. It will be out in May. And this is a book that took really about 10 years for us to create. And it is looking back into the history of the interpersonal school and trying to reconnect with that radical edge that which was the work of the 1930s and early 1940s on society and politics and race and culture amongst the interpersonal psychoanalysts, which over time was lost in the same way that I think we lost touch with what Fromm has to say. Okay, thank you. Let me stop share.